So, welcome everyone. As I see attendees are still joining. Yeah, we are now in our module number three of our Climate Smart Agricultural Learning Series, Understand, Design, Act, Climate Proof Your Supply Chain. Today, we're going to learn how effects of climate change can be managed. And next slide, please. I would like to introduce to you two ladies, one you have known already from the last webinars. Next slide, please. So with me is today Danielle Knuppel, Global Coffee Monitoring Program Director at World Coffee Research. And she's going to tell you the state of the art of research with coffee, and Catherine Selengia, Program Manager at Hans-Ernst Neumann Stiftung. And if you have participated already in the previous modules, you will know her already. And you see on the bottom there myself, Caroline Glofka from the Global Coffee Platform, facilitating a little bit in the background. So next slide, please. What are we going to discuss today? Understanding how to manage the effects of climate change. And here we look a little bit at the tools, at farming practices and resilient coffee varieties and the state of the art of research. And as always, we will have lots of time to answer your questions. Next, please. Not everyone is so familiar maybe with Zoom we are using for this webinar. So later in the question and answer session, if you have a question, you can either raise your hand and we unmute you and you can speak up. Otherwise, you are invited to put any questions at any time into the question and answer box, and we will answer those questions then later. Your microphone, again, is silenced unless you raise your hand and we can unmute you. Remember, we record this session so that people who cannot attend today can listen to it later. We will post this on the website, and I will also send the recording and presentation round later. Next slide, please. Yeah, just a short introduction again to the learning series for those people who are attending the first time. GCP partnered this year. We started discussing last year with the Alliance for Resilient Coffee, the organizations under there. You see, it's a program from USAID called Feed the Future. Under that is the Alliance for Resilient Coffee with the organizations you see there, the logos, where we thought there are still so many questions around climate change in coffee that we want to bring more learnings to a wider audience, and that's why we put together the learning series. We have also partnered, if you look to the right-hand side, with a few other organizations to develop a climate catalog, which will be a resource that will be developed and we can bring to you later in the year, and we will have a little bit of time to present in another module. Next, please. Remind ourselves a little bit about the objectives of this learning series. So it's really understand what are the issues in climate change, but also to enable you as participants to plan and implement and scale effective climate smart agricultural practices and tools. It's to learn how to assess the risks in your supply chain, but also convey the value of climate smart agricultural investment to people in your company or to other organizations you would like to work with. And it's all to align your actions and join concrete actions. And what does this concrete action mean? Next slide, please, I'll show you. So this series has a consecutive order. It started with an introduction. Last time we were introduced to risk profiles. Today we're going to learn about tools that are available. Next time we will address how to scale climate smart agriculture. And then of course one would want to know how to monitor that. And in the end, we'll have two modules where we show the business case that investments in climate smart agriculture are working. And then also how can organizations collaborate? How does it work? This is all to understand and design and act for you. To help a little bit here, we are building 2 cases in Honduras and Uganda. Next slide, please. So you have seen probably these slides before, and next time I will update you on the progress that we're making. But we want to show in Honduras and Uganda 2 activities where we will invite you to join and cooperate based, or these activities will contribute to the agendas of the national coffee platforms. It will be a multi-stakeholder collaboration, so not only one company, one organization, but many joining together. Learnings and results from this will be shared with the sector to scale or duplicate. And of course, the progress then will be measured. And next time, as I mentioned, we will show where these proposals are standing at the moment. Next slide, please. So this learning series, you've heard already contributions from Keely and Kate and Mark. We have ahead of us great other experts coming to you. So I'm really looking forward to that. Especially today, again, I would like to welcome Danielle and Kate bringing the content to us. So over to you, ladies. Thank you.
Great, thanks Caroline, and good morning, good afternoon everyone, wherever you may be. So we're going to jump into the content for today. Our question we're trying to answer: how can I manage the effects climate change is having on my supply chain? So we're going to look at a few different elements of how you might approach that question. The first is to understand the challenges. So the challenges in managing effects. How do you actually implement at the farm level, and what are the challenges in doing so? Excuse me. Understanding the research that's being conducted on CSA practices and strategies, and including on resilient varieties. And then we'll also be understanding one approach, one methodology for managing effects of climate change or climate variability, the coffee and climate approach, and its accompanying toolbox. And we'll go through those and how those can be used. So starting with the challenges, so we've, over the last couple of modules, talked about how climate is clearly already affecting coffee production, how that's being seen in different ways in a number of different locales. So why isn't climate smart agriculture being more widely adopted? And first of all, we've talked about part of that issue being that people aren't quite sure what climate smart agriculture really is, what that means. So just to review a couple slides we've used in previous sessions, we've said that climate smart agriculture can be broken into 3 types of actions. So we have the farming practices, like cover crops, shade management, irrigation. These are things that are done on the farm to adapt, mostly to adapt to current climate variability, to a lesser extent to prepare for long-term climate change. Strategies which could be implemented by a producer, a farmer, it could be a producer organization, community, really anyone within the supply chain. So it could be implemented on or off the farm. But here we're talking about strategies like on or off farm diversification, choosing the right varieties for the long-term climate, anticipated climate change, changing processing methods. So these are strategies. And then enablers would be, again, things that could be supported by actors throughout the value chain, but are really trying to establish the conditions needed to implement CSA strategies and practices. So here we're talking mostly about resources in terms of either financing, information, or technical assistance. So there's several different types of actions that can be taken by different types of actors. And then in the last module, we also talked about the different variables and risks to coffee production, and how the level of the response needs to correspond with the context and with the risk exposure in that region. So we looked at incremental change, systemic change, and transformative change, and what these 3 types of adaptations could look like throughout the value chain. We've touched on that briefly, but we will have a module that will spend much more time looking at particularly how value chain actors outside of the farm level can be involved in incremental, systemic, and transformative change. That will be covered in the module in October. And so today what we want to focus on more is on the farm level. And generally speaking, within the series, we're looking more at the incremental and systemic change categories, just because we're speaking from a sector perspective, and we want to be able to keep people in coffee if we can, and if it makes sense. So at the farm level, we know that farmers are feeling climate impacts. We know they're seeing these effects on their coffee production. So why aren't they taking up some of these practices? Again, it's maybe a lack of clarity around what these kinds of practices might be, but it's certainly also because there is not, as we've said before, there's no one size fits all solution. So it's in addition to the climate variability that we've talked about, there are also diverse agronomic factors and socioeconomic factors at play. So that can be even within the same community. You might, particularly in regions with high-grown coffee, there might be microclimates that can vary substantially, from farming areas that are just a couple of miles apart. So what may be adequate shade in one location might invite pest problems in another location fairly nearby. So on top of that, there are also these household factors that need to be considered, like the demographics, age and gender, and just general household makeup, and the different economic relationships with coffee. So for some, it's a core income, and for others, it might be more like a savings account. That there's not a lot of investment being made into coffee, but they may tap into the few coffee trees they have when they need some extra income. And then, of course, there's also this limited access to inputs, equipment, infrastructure, information, weather data, and technical training. So so there are these two kinds of factors at play, and how do you determine what kinds of practices and strategies would be appropriate, and then how do you encourage uptake of those practices? So today we're going to talk more about the how do you select the practices and strategies, and in the next session in July we'll be looking more at what are the challenges of uptake and scale. So how do you design your intervention? How do you know which practices and strategies work? Well, a key component of that, of course, is understanding what evidence there is, what research is out there, what do we know, what do we not know about climate resilient farming. So we're going to have Danielle from World Coffee Research talk about the research that they're doing, and that currently is and will be in the future generating information on which strategies are most effective in which contexts. So I'll hand over to Danielle.
Thanks, Kate. Next slide. Okay, as Kate and Carolyn mentioned, I'm from World Coffee Research, and I manage one of our programs called the Global Coffee Monitoring Program. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit today about some of the research and the tools that we have developed and are implementing. Next slide. Just to remind everybody why we're doing this. As you all know, at our current annual consumption growth rate of about 3%, coffee farmers have to produce about 15 to 20% more coffee by 2020. So the demand is rising, but the area where coffee is growing is decreasing due to climate change. And so this is a big problem that we need to think about. And not only that, but coffee farmers are also facing a lot of threats to their crops, like pests and diseases. And in many countries, especially in Mexico or in Central America, rust is a fungus that's really affecting a lot of farmers, and coffee varieties are losing their resistance to rust. And so this is a particular area where a lot of research needs to be done still, and it's a really unique time for the coffee industry to put effort into supporting research and development in climate smart agriculture for coffee. Next slide. So World Coffee Research works in several different areas. A big focus of ours is in helping to or facilitating the development of new coffee varieties. And so we work together with local partners, coffee research institutions in coffee producing countries to implement coffee breeding programs. Also related to this, we have an expanding network of research trials that are in research stations and also in farmers' fields. We've developed some standards for the coffee sector that I'll tell you about. And we produce tools that can help farmers and the industry make good decisions on practices to use. World Coffee Research was only created about 6 years ago. We're a young organization, and we were created by the coffee industry in the recognition that more innovation is needed for coffee agriculture. Next slide. So a lot has been done already, but more is needed. For example, F1 hybrids are new varieties that are showing to have a lot of usefulness. So they're showing to be more tolerant to diseases and pests. They have higher yields, higher cup quality, and they're showing to be more resilient in different climate conditions, which all leads to more profitability for farmers. If you compare a watermelon to coffee, you'll find that there's over 2,600 watermelon varieties that are registered. And for coffee, it's only 36 varieties that are registered. So really a lot more research needs to be done in improving varieties and practices that farmers can use. So this goes to show that a lot can be done with varieties, but that's not, the only area where we need research. Next slide. So as I mentioned, it's not enough to create new varieties. A big collaborative effort is also needed to ensure that the varieties are tested and made available in new locations. And farmers need to know about the different varieties available, and they need to have the ability to choose the best varieties. And farmers need to have good access to healthy plants from nurseries. And lastly, farmers and investors need to see with their eyes and also in figures that it's a good choice to start to use a new variety or agricultural practice. So in the past several years, WCR has started several programs to address some of these needs. New slide. One of our programs is called the International Multi-Location Variety Trial. And in this trial, we test varieties in different locations and in different environments globally to see how well they do in different conditions. So they're grown at different altitudes, different climate zones, and they are affected with different pest and disease threats and are grown in different soil conditions so that we can see how well they do. And the big goal here is to get these varieties out into different areas for farmers to have access to them. Next slide. So we are already implementing this program in 23 different countries. We have 35 top performing Arabica varieties that are in test plots with partners. Typically, our partners for these types of trials are the research institutions, and they're placed in the fields. And right now, some of the oldest trials are about 3 years old, and we're starting to collect information about those varieties and how well they're performing. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, we work really closely with our partner institutions to implement this program. One of the first things to do was to gather the 35 top performing varieties. We then work together with a lab in Florida to replicate the plants in vitro so that they're sterile. And the reason why we do that is because it's really hard to export, import soil, and we need to make sure that it's pathogen-free and sterile. So that helps in the importation process when we're getting these new varieties out to different countries where they never existed before. So we send the varieties out, and we work together with our partners to then collect data, monitor the performance of the varieties, and then after several years, the best ones for that location are selected and hopefully multiplied with some private sector nurseries and made available to coffee producers. Next slide. So we're already finding some preliminary results that's really interesting. For example, in Laos, in one of our trials, there was a pretty deep frost this past February. And as you can see in the picture on the left, a lot of the coffee plants were severely damaged. A lot of dieback and the leaves were blackened. But we did see that for some of the varieties, in particular, some of the hybrids, they weren't so affected by the frost. So it's still too early to make conclusions, and we're still monitoring and evaluating, but this type of information is really valuable to understand the climate resilience of different varieties. Next slide. Okay, so another tool that we have is the coffee variety catalog. So the premise of this tool is that people really need to understand what's available. And before this catalog, nothing existed for farmers to access and to understand what varieties are out there. And so we have put this catalog together. It is available online for free, open, anybody can access, and it's also downloadable PDF online. And so this catalog includes profiles of different varieties, some traditional varieties like Caturra, Bourbon, Geisha, also some newly developed F1 hybrids, and it also describes a wide range of disease-tolerant varieties. Next slide. So this is basically a visual of what the catalog looks like, and you can see we included a lot of graphics that are easy to read and easy to understand, that gives a lot of quick information about the varieties. So this is describing the hybrid 1 Centro Americano variety, which is a dwarf plant, has information on the leaf color, the size of the bean, the optimal altitude where it grows, the potential for cup quality, the potential for yield, and it gives information on is it resistant or tolerant to different diseases. Next slide. We also give information on which year does it start to produce cherries. The Centro Americano starts producing in year 2, that it does require a good amount of nutrition, fertilizer, and that the ripening happens not early, not late, but at an average time frame, and has a very high cherry to green bean outturn. So it gives a lot of information about each variety, and also then where to access, or who owns the variety, who developed it, and how to access the variety. Next slide. So say a farmer knows about the varieties and has made a decision to buy a certain variety. But say that, the variety has been already tested in his or her country and is registered and available, but can the farmer go to a local nursery and be sure that he or she is getting the variety that he or she wants to buy? And also, can the farmer be sure that the plant is actually a healthy plant? So this is a gap that's often overlooked. And so we have developed a standard for varieties to create, to ensure that the plants that people are buying are true to the variety and healthy plants. Next slide. So there are 4 different pillars or areas where nurseries or seed producers are certified by a third-party certifier. And first of all, the nurseries need to, in order to get certified, they need to be using good nursery practices for healthy and disease-free plants. They undergo a DNA fingerprinting to make sure that the plants are the correct variety that they think they are. Then we have to make sure that the nursery is also providing information to farmers on different varieties so that the farmer can have a good understanding of what they're buying. And then we also want to make sure that the nurseries are respecting the rights of the breeder. So if a nursery undergoes this audit, they can then be certified to become a WCR verified nursery. Next slide. And so does this really matter? That's a question. It's a good question to ask, and we feel that it absolutely does matter. If you look at the picture on the top left, it shows a farmer holding a leaf of a coffee plant that he thought was to be from a variety that's resistant to leaf rust. But as you can see, the leaf is showing some major signs of leaf rust. And on the picture on the right, this coffee tree was uprooted because it was looking really sick. And you can see that the root in the coffee tree is curling. And this is something that happens in the nurseries when they're not grown in the correct types of containers. And so this oftentimes isn't known to farmers until they have their trees out in their fields already growing for maybe a few years. And that's just too late for this big of an investment for farmers. And farmers really need to know that they're buying healthy and genetically correct varieties. Next slide. Okay. So another program that we are implementing, it's about a 2-year-old program, is called the Global Coffee Monitoring Program. And you know, farmers tend to be conservative, and they tend to stick to the methods and practices and varieties that they know. And it's absolutely reasonable, because it's risky to try something new that farmers have never seen working before. And so this program is really to put in farmers' fields to test some varieties and some practices in a low-risk environment, so that farmers can see what can happen. What are the results if they use improved varieties and practices? Next slide. So this program is a global program, and we are expanding the program into more countries. The trials are not done in research institutions, they're in farmers' fields, which is a really unique, and the reason why is because it's done in realistic conditions, and it's also done in a participatory way where farmers and partners can help select the varieties and practices, and also help with the data collection. So the aim is to put these trials in a diversity of countries, and also a diversity of locations within the countries, to capture the different ecosystems where coffee farming is done. These trials are also done from smallholder farmers up to large-scale producers. And they're at higher elevations, lower elevations, and different types of topography to capture the diversity. Next slide. So a farmer really relies heavily on the plants that they have and the soils on the farm. And in so many cases, the plants are out of date, and the varieties and the soils have been depleted. The soils aren't able to hold the nutrients or water anymore. And so these factors, combined with a changing climate, lead to lower yields and lower profits, and eventually coffee farmers don't feel like coffee is attractive anymore, and they might go into other crops. So really, adoption of new varieties and agricultural practices is greatly needed. Next slide. This is the design of a on-farm technology trial in a farmer's field. And you can see going in one direction, we have the plant varieties. And we have 3 varieties that we include in this trial. First is the farmer's existing variety, which acts as a control for comparison. Then we have 2 other varieties that are tested against the control. Going the other direction are agronomic treatments, or it's basically a package of practices that the farmer is using. And you have the existing practices that the farmer does, and then you also have treatment A and B, which are slight improvements to what the farmer is doing. So you can see there's 9 plots within the trial, and each plot has a specific variety and a specific agricultural practice package. And so what we're looking at is which combination of the variety and the agricultural practices leads to higher profitability for that farmer. These trials are typically ranging between 1,000 meters squared to 5,000 meters squared. Next slide. So when we decide on the varieties to include in the trials, we consider the altitude, and also in discussions with farmers and partners, what are they most interested in? Is it higher yields? Is it pest and disease tolerance? Is it higher cup quality? And we also need to consider the availability of different varieties in those countries. So the control varieties are the ones that are typically used already in that area. Variety A is selected among the most promising, best performing national varieties, and variety B is selected among more regional varieties. Next slide. This shows some examples of agronomic treatments that we include, and these are often climate smart treatments. On the top left, you see a row of coffee grown in between temporary shade. That's done for the first few years to provide more shade to the plant and the soil. In the top middle is a steep slope, and there's a line of grass that's grown in between as a ground cover and barrier. On the top right, coffee is grown together with banana trees. On the bottom left, there's a ground cover called mimosa that's grown there to help preserve the soil. And in the bottom middle is a mulch that's being used in coffee. So these are some examples of the climate smart practices that we include in our trials. Next slide. So we work with partners. Again, we can't do it on our own, and our partners are often roasters, exporters, NGOs, cooperatives. We work together with agronomists to train them and help us in monitoring and doing the data collection for the trials. Next slide. These are some examples of the data that is included in our trials. And you can see it's a good amount of data. Starting in year 3 is when we then start to collect information on the harvest, and we're able to calculate more closely the profitability for farmers. One thing that's also really important to note is that we learn so much from the farmers. We get feedback from them, and that constant feedback helps us to make our research more effective. Next slide. So I think the bottom is cut off here, but which shows the totals. But here you see our targets for trials and our scaling out of our trials. Right now we're focused on Arabica trials, but in 2020 we are planning to start some Robusta trials. By 2023, we'll have a network of about 1,200 trials, which will provide us a lot of information globally on what's happening. Next slide. So there's certainly a lot of information that'll be generated from this network, and it'll be key that this information gets into the hands of farmers and others that are working closely with farmers. These trials have been in place for 2 years now, and so data is still forthcoming, but we hope to have a better understanding of what combinations of varieties and practices are most profitable for farmers. We want to increase the body of knowledge about what practices and varieties work well in changing climate. Since this all goes into a global database, we'll be able to monitor climate conditions and disease movement on a regional or global level. And overall, this information is intended to enable smart investment and increase the overall global supply of high quality coffee. Next slide. So as WCR's programs scale up over the next few years, we're hoping to make this data available that we're starting to generate. And I hope that you'll be able to access some of the tools that we already have available. Thank you.
Great, thanks Danielle. So we're going to move on now to talk about how we can use some of the research that's being done and how we can really implement at the farm level. So first I wanted to give a little bit of background about Hans-Neumann Stiftung, the Neumann Foundation, for those of you who may not be familiar. So we are a nonprofit organization. We work with smallholder coffee farmers all over the world. Every year we work with about 2,500 farmer organizations and about 165,000 farmers. We are focused really on supporting and lifting up what we see as the base of the pyramid of producers. So the 70% of coffee farmers that produce just 30% of the global coffee supply. So our focus is on helping those farmers to organize, to become more productive and be better able to achieve a sustainable livelihood. And we see as a key part of that, of course, climate resilience. And so our climate work, obviously through the Feed the Future Alliance for Resilient Coffee, and also through our the Initiative for Coffee and Climate, of which we are the lead implementing organization. So the Initiative for Coffee and Climate was launched in 2010. It was launched by members of the coffee sector with the Neumann Foundation as the implementing agent. And the initial efforts of that initiative were focused on trying to understand, what's being done out in terms of climate adaptation strategies in different contexts. So we started in 4 key producing regions. We were working in Brazil, the Trifinio region of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, Vietnam, and Tanzania. Because of the strategic relevance as key coffee producing regions, but also because they're very diverse. So we have representation of Arabica and Robusta production, intense and growing systems, wet and dry processing. So the idea was to work in a range of different contexts and try to better understand what climate hazards and impacts are being felt and what are some of the local strategies being used to address those, and to test out some more innovative practices in different contexts and be able to cross-pollinate that learning. And so since launching in 2010, we've reached more than 35,000 producers with that work. We've trained more than 400 extensionists on our methodology, and we've shared all of the knowledge that we've harvested from this project, from this initiative in the Coffee and Climate Toolbox. So, our key focus in our climate work as an organization has been to, 1, understand which practices and strategies work in which contexts, and we have done some testing and produced case studies that look at specific practices, strategies, and enablers, and I'm going to present a few of those in a minute. 2, we share that information publicly. So again, the CNC Toolbox I'll introduce in a moment. And then we are working to help producers and producer organizations to select the appropriate practices and strategies for their context, and then to support them in implementing that. And that is through the Coffee and Climate approach. So I'm going to start with the sharing part here. So this is the CNC Toolbox. I'll share a link at the end of the presentation. But this is a website that has a compilation of all of the tools, the climate maps, the case studies, guidelines, training materials, all of the work that we've been conducting ourselves and collecting from others through the course of our climate work. And the idea here is to equip the coffee sector, but especially coffee farming communities with the information they need to assess and respond to their climate risks. So just, the main target audience of this website is trainers and cooperative management, anybody who's working directly with producers in the field. But for those of you that are different parts of the value chain, there's also valuable information here that can certainly provide a frame of reference for understanding climate change better and understanding the different kinds of options that have been explored in different regions. This is also an open, it's an open source, it's an open website, but also it's meant to be a platform for knowledge exchange. So, we have all of the information that we've collected ourselves, but we also encourage others to submit tools, to submit any case studies and information to the site and have this be kind of a central knowledge hub on this topic. So if you see here on the left, the homepage has a search engine. So if you already have a sense of the topic that you are interested in, whether it's a particular country, a climate hazard, a particular farming practice, you can type that in and it will pull up what you're looking for. If you're not sure what you're looking for, you can click on this tab, Find a Tool, and you can see here on the right, there's a series of drop-down options, and you can select which practices might be relevant to your context. So, on this site, you can explore and you can see different practices that we've been testing and a number of the case studies that show you how to implement step by step and provide the data on where we've trialed the practices and strategies. And so I wanted to give a little bit of background on our case studies. So at the practice level, we of course are measuring changes in yield and in productivity. That's I think the key thing that people are looking for. But we also use some fairly high tech but low cost instruments to be able to closely monitor the effects on the coffee plant both above ground and below. And so Danielle kind of referenced that you may not be aware of what's happening within the root system, and so there are measurements that we are taking within our trials to be very objective and concrete about the effects that practices are having on the coffee plant. And we use equipment that is, as I said, fairly low cost, but especially also easy to use, so that technicians, farmers, PhD students, really anyone can be taking the measurements, and we can train them to do that. So you can see some of the examples of the equipment here. I'll cover a little bit, but we have smart buttons, which are miniature temperature loggers. We have rain gauges, infrared cameras, drones for aerial monitoring. And we use these things to be able to measure things like soil temperature during the production cycle. So we can plant a smart button and be able to take ongoing temperature readings. We can look at temperature distribution on the plot with the infrared sensors. We can look at leaf temperature and look at root growth. And so these things are again, key to understanding how effective practices are working and looking a little bit beyond just yield and productivity. So I wanted to show you a few case studies that touch on this framework of CSA of practices, strategies, and enablers. Starting with one case study of a practice in Central America. This is a case study that I referenced in our first webinar, where we saw very positive impacts of cover crops and temporary shade. So particularly for young coffee trees under 2 years are especially vulnerable to drought. And high temperatures, once they're moved to the field and planted, because their roots are still in development, and the high temperatures can reduce the water and nutrient intake for the roots. So in this case, that was identified, and cover crop, Brachiaria ruziziensis, and temporary shade trees, Cahanas cahan, called colloquially gandul, were identified as some promising options. And so these were introduced with the intention of maintaining lower soil temperatures, conserving soil humidity, and thereby encouraging greater root development. So to measure the soil temperature, we inserted smart buttons, so those miniature temperature loggers at 5 centimeters depth underground, and we took readings every day for 240 days, every 3 hours. And what we saw was that soil temperature stayed lower with the cover crops, soil moisture was retained, and the root systems grew deeper and stronger. So one of the major differences that we saw was in the maximum temperatures of the soil. So you can see here, this blue is the soil temperature in the control where they did not have cover crops. And the red is the soil temperature with cover crops. And these zones here are the yellow and the pink zones are critical zones for coffee. So after being exposed to temperatures between 33 and 38 degrees Celsius for more than 2 hours, the root system of a coffee tree can start to die. And you may not see this, it may not be evident from the foliage, it might still seem okay, but the plant won't be taking nutrients or water. So you'll see a lack of growth and height in the first year, and very likely, even if you don't see that change in height, you will definitely see problems with flowering in the next year. And above 38 degrees is when you'll start to see damage to the foliage almost immediately. So we can see here both increases in height and width with the cover crops and with the cover crops and temporary shade, increases in yield, almost tripling in more than tripling in yield, and more than tripling in income. And we also saw a slight bump in quality. So here's another example of a practice that was introduced, this time in Vietnam, where lack of water for irrigation is considered to be one of the biggest challenges that will face coffee production in the future. So irrigation is fairly common throughout the coffee producing regions of the Central Highlands. But what we found through our initial risk analysis process was that many farmers were overusing irrigation. They didn't know what the appropriate amount to be watering their coffee. And so we introduced training and a methodology for determining the right amount to be providing to each tree for each round of irrigation. So this water saving irrigation tool is very low tech. It's a matter of filling a 200-liter barrel and using a stopwatch. We did some analysis to be able to determine what the recommendations for the right amount of water should be, taking into account what was the average rainfall from the previous rainy season. So looking at November and December in this case. So if we kind of determine if there's an average rainfall, then this is how much irrigation you need. If there's high rainfall, then this is how much irrigation you need. And we were able to train 17 farmers and 3 agronomists on this technique, and then scaled that with more than 900 farmers. The farmers may have been a little bit reluctant to introduce this technique originally because, you know, it seems kind of counterintuitive that if they're facing drought, they should use less water. But because they were facing drought and they needed to conserve, they were kind of pushed to take on this practice, and then saw that it had no effect on their yield, and in fact was saving them money on both water and fuel. So we saw that all farmers in that project reduced their water use by about 30%. Here is a strategy that was implemented in Tanzania. So this is an example where you know, this doesn't necessarily apply to coffee directly, but it was found in Tanzania that due to, again, unreliable rain and high temperatures, the farmers couldn't count on a consistent income from coffee, and they needed help with food security. And so we introduced conservation agriculture on maize production to complement their coffee farming. Conservation agriculture refers to, it's a number of practices that are intended to conserve the soil, essentially. Conserve soil, moisture, fertilizer, as well as energy, time, and money. It's a no-tillage approach to maize farming. So they introduced that, trialed that with 200 farmers, again, scaled to more than 1,000 farmers, and saw increases in yields of maize from 25% to 100% in first season, which meant that there was a reduced risk of crop failure and more secure household food security. Here's an example of an enabler that was introduced in Brazil. So during the risk assessment phase, it was determined that there wasn't enough local weather data to understand the local climate risks. So there was a perception that some of the regional data did not reflect what farmers were experiencing, but they didn't have the data to back that up. So we introduced weather data collection in 4 communities. We trained producers how to measure daily rainfall and temperature, and we introduced weather data sheets that they would fill out every day, and we would collect monthly, enter it into a database, and then analyze with them, and then go back to the communities to compare the local data with the historical weather station data and adjust extension accordingly. And so this was interesting because what we found in this area was that on average, this community was wetter than the regional average. It was on average it was much wetter on the average, but it was significantly drier during specific months. So in February, it was much drier than what the regional data would show, and much wetter during March than what regional data was showing. We also saw with minimum temperature, it was lower than the region, and average maximum temperature was higher. So tracking this from year to year can help you to generate a better understanding of how local climate may be fluctuating. It might be changing more rapidly than the regional estimates are implying, and then you can adjust accordingly. So these are some examples of some of these practices, strategies, enablers that we've had experience with. They are certainly not exhaustive. I would invite you to look at the CNC Toolbox for more information and to look around for what seems most relevant to you and your supply chain. But I wanted to introduce those to give you kind of a sense of the work that we've been doing. And then just to use that as an example, let's look back at the climate hazards and impacts that we identified for Honduras in the risk profile that we looked at in the last session. So we knew that, overall we're seeing an increase in storms, irregular rainfall, increasing temperature, drought, high temperatures, high winds. These are some of, again, the same kinds of climate hazards that we're seeing in a lot of different places. So how do you determine how to develop a climate adaptation plan with a particular group of farmers in Honduras? Do you just send them to the CNC website and let them look around and then call it a day? No. So we have an approach that we suggest that is followed. It's the coffee and climate approach. This is a systematic process of steps that are meant to build on one another to help farmers and extensionists and trainers to assess climate risks at the local level, identify options, and then develop strategies and implement those strategies. So the process starts with, at a high level, setting the scene, much the same as what we've been following in this webinar series of introducing the concept of climate change, introducing the terminology, taking in, at the case of a country level, the CSA maps that were shared in the last session, the country reports that they're producing, for example, for Honduras, looking at what is the big picture of this issue, is this an issue, and then getting more into what we call triangulation, which is taking the research that's available, comparing that with farmer observations and with expert technician observations to determine, what are the local climate hazards, the climate risks and challenges to addressing those. So we use a participatory methodology that enhances the local ownership and ensures that all of the key actors are coming together and thinking about the problem, working together to come up with the solutions that are most locally applicable. And then adaptation planning. So identifying those adaptation options and then determining which are most feasible to implement, and then implementing. So we do farmer field schools, direct farmer training. We do on-farm trials, testing new ideas that may work in that particular context. This also includes the global coffee monitoring program that Danielle was sharing with us. That can be one of the types of trials that we offer. We create demonstration plots, which are very effective in showing farmers what's working and facilitating exchange between farmers. And then we start data collection to see, what is being most effective. And then the last step of that is looking at the lessons learned and understanding the progress. So what are the experiences from the field showing us in terms of the costs and benefits of the adaptation practices that we selected? And what is the data showing? And then taking that learning and potentially developing refining the strategy or developing a new strategy. And I think a key component of this is recognizing that this is a cyclical process. So the idea is to build the capacity of those involved so that if they need to, they could do this process again as climate hazards change. And all of this can be found, guidance on how to implement this can be found in the source book, which is available in the CNC Toolbox. Well, yeah, I'll cover that in a minute. So I wanted to touch a little bit more on this, this topic of triangulation of risk assessments. So, again, the CAT maps, the information that Mark presented in the last module can give a framework for understanding climate risks, but really the farmers have the firsthand experience of the local conditions, and they often have perspectives that reach back several decades. So the first part of this triangulation process is to interview a number of farmers, hold workshops and focus group discussions, and then the clear effects of climate often become apparent for that local context. Then we work with extensionists who may have less intimate knowledge of a particular location, but they often have a better grasp of the zonal changes and particularly some of the past extreme incidents, and they may have some access to quantitative data. And then we compare that with not just the kind of macro risk analysis, but also if there are any meteorological records, any studies that are particular to that location, any quantitative data that we can get our hands on. But realistically, that's often very generalized and pretty out of date. Okay. Try to speed through because we want to leave time for questions and answers. So I'll skip through, so you come up with a list, you determine what are the key factors in how readily you could adopt certain practices, you rank those, come up with an adaptation plan, and then, as I said, start training and providing and generating demonstration plots. And so what we've seen is that farmers are ready to adopt climate smart agriculture. It takes time. So, you can see here in this chart, the first, the light green shows the level of adoption after the first year, and the darker green shows the level of adoption after the second year. So, this tells us that there is, a willingness to adopt practices, but people kind of need to see that it's effective first before they're willing to do that. With the exception of, you can see here in the Trufinio region, where rust management was overwhelmingly accepted and cover crops were overwhelmingly adopted in the first year because they were already facing that problem, and they really had no choice but to adopt those techniques. Skip through. So, and then the other aspect, as I mentioned, for the CNC approach is we're trying to build your capacity to be able to replicate the process. So we're trying to transfer knowledge, build the capacity of your technicians. It takes about a 2.5-year process initially to get through this cycle, implementing with a group of farmers and a group of technicians. We provide backstopping throughout the process. Certain activities we lead, but to the extent that we can, we're trying to transition to allowing you to lead yourself. And we think that this is an effective approach. It's been proved in the field. There's evidence of its effectiveness. It's a scalable model because we have this training of trainers curriculum. It's not meant to stand alone. It can, but it also can very easily integrate within your existing extension message. So this, it's flexible, and And we want to work with you in however you're currently providing extension. And then again, it's open source. So the idea is that we all continue to learn from one another as others contribute to the CNC Toolbox, as others can share knowledge across different countries. You can continue to benefit from the latest findings. So I want to make sure we have time for questions. So we'll be just briefly next module, we'll be looking at how can you scale CSA, what are ways to de-risk CSA. And as I said, we'll be looking at the technical challenges of that and the financing challenges. There's some resources that you can, we'll share this in the, when we upload this on the website. And we'll switch over now to Q&A. We have about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Kate. This is Caroline. Please, to all participants, be invited to use the question and answer box to put in your questions, or raise your hand if you wanted to have a direct comment. We can unmute you. But thank you to start with. This was amazing and a wealth of information. So I understand it takes quite some time to get the results, and Danielle, I'm impressed what World Coffee Research has done in this 6 years and achieved already with the, trials in 23 countries. Amazing. Kate, what did I take away? Very hands-on practical tools. Again, I learned they need time to use. I found it very practical that Coffee and Climate also helps with the implementation and provides practical steps for farmers, trainers, and extensionists to develop a strategy and then, of course, have the tools available. Thank you. But to the participants, any questions from your side? We have one question I would like to take first. And someone is writing, it is not clear what role GCP plays here besides hosting the session. Yeah, thank you. Indeed, one should look at the role of GCP, what the main roles are, and that is one big role is convening and facilitating. So we are convening and bringing together the industry, different stakeholders, but the private sector also with the public sector. So in this case, for example, the opportunities we are developing together with ARC in Uganda and Honduras also have to align with the agendas of the national coffee platforms. So there's a link that we are providing. But it is also when we come to module 5, for example, where it is about impact and measuring, we will also introduce the GCP tool is developing to measure the progress of sustainability. So there are quite a few roles. No, GCP is not an implementer. That's why we have the Alliance partners here who are perfect implementers with all the knowledge there. Then maybe Kate, you want to take the next question?
Sure, yeah. The question was, which research institute is involved in Brazil besides Hans Neumann? I'm asking a colleague right now to make sure I get the names right, but I can tell you that we, through the course of having worked in Brazil on the topic of climate for the last almost 8 years, we've moved from kind of working as Caroline was saying, very, very closely in the field to now starting to do more collaboration with other stakeholders. And so we've formed a community of practice, which includes the GCP, the National Coffee Platform, as well as a number of NGOs, the coffee institutes for the country, and I believe there may be some universities, but I apologize that I don't know off the top of my head all the members of the community of practice, but I can certainly get in touch with you directly and let you know after the webinar today. I just got a message from one of our colleagues, so I have a couple colleagues on the call today that can better answer some of the technical questions or more specific questions on particular countries. But he told me that we're working with IPAMIG in Brazil and with Lavras. So I hope that answers your question. Okay.
Any other questions, please?
No? Okay. I have a question for Danielle. Maybe you can speak a little bit about, towards the end of your presentation, you were talking about how the information that you're collecting through your trials can help to inform companies throughout the value chain to make smarter investments. And I was wondering if there are any current examples of how the information is being applied, or if you have kind of ideas about how the data could actually inform decision making.
Thanks, Kate. So I have to just preface with saying that the on-farm trials that we typically do together with partners, private sector or NGO partners or cooperatives, those are the oldest trials are about 2 years old now, and so we are still in the data collection phase. And so but what we are planning to do is each year annually put together a brief, like a report of data from each of those trials, and get that out to our farmers and to the partners that are helping to sponsor the trials, and include information on the weather conditions, the weather data, the vegetative growth of the plant, any disease conditions. Also, after year 3, starting to add information on profitability for that farmer. And so these are really good information because it's showing like which variety in combination with which practice is more profitable for a farmer. And that's not only useful for the farmer, but also useful for the supply chain investors, the buyers of the coffee for that farmer, who might have a program with those farmers and will want to scale up some of those recommendations that are coming from those trials. It's also useful for the farmer to have put together a business plan and then bring that information to a financial institution for access to credit. So that's how we foresee this data being used, and in the next few years we hope to get there. And in fact, I saw Caroline, you had asked or suggested Katrien from EFICO to talk about their connection with us, and we are working with EFICO. EFICO is one of our partners in Guatemala and Honduras. We have some trials that we're putting in place in Honduras through a partnership with EFICO and some of the cooperatives that they work with to put in some of these field trials. The same situation is with HRNS in Guatemala and also in Honduras to put together these trials. And this information is shared with the partner as well as shared globally, widely with the coffee sector.
That's great. And did Katrien from EFICO want to say something? Should we?
I don't know. I think she didn't raise her hand.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So maybe okay. Not at the moment.
Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah. Any more questions? Otherwise, we would move to the last slides.
Well, Kate, I saw that you had posted some information on adoption, and I thought that was really interesting. And it looks like adoption is quite high in several of your areas that you're working in, and that's so promising. I'm just wondering, are there some factors that help contribute to adoption? Like, what sort of characteristics of the households that help for adoption?
Mm-hmm. I think in terms of the characteristics of the households, that's something that we're going to talk about quite a bit in the next session on scaling, where the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture will be talking about farmer segmentation and how you can look at certain typologies of farmer households and which types of practices they might be more readily able to adopt. So we'll cover that in more depth then. But I think just generally speaking, what lends itself well to adoption, or what we've seen success in, is I guess a couple, maybe three factors. So one, first of all, as I said, like with the example for Vietnam, where they were facing drought, they kind of had to be more willing to look at irrigation and reducing water use. Or in the case of Trufinio, where they were facing a rust crisis, they had to be looking at other options. So sometimes the climate impacts, the hazards, push farmers to the extent that they have to look at experimentation. Other cases, the second point I would say is the time. So as I said, like having the opportunity for producers to see the results of demo plots, to kind of become sensitized to the issue over time, is really critical. These are big decisions that they're making that may be potentially risky, and they want to know that things are going to be effective. And I think that's kind of tied to the third piece, which is building trust in communities. So what we find is very effective in how we work. Our technicians are all based in the communities. They come from the communities in which they're working. So oftentimes they are coffee farmers themselves. They are running their own demo plots, and they're always available to the farmers that they're working with. And then also the fact that we have farmer exchanges. So farmers are not necessarily learning from us or from an extensionist, but from their from their neighbors. And so I think that those are kind of the three factors I would say are most critical.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think that was a perfect bridge for the next tool that is going to be on, the next module that is going to be on July 19th. How can I scale CSA? So Kate, thank you for giving that sneak preview, where we will have Elizabeth Teague from Root Capital and Laurence from International Institute for Tropical Agriculture. So with that, I want to thank Danielle and Kate for your contribution and sharing your knowledge today, and the participants for your questions. And we hope to see you then, or hear you again on July 19th. If you do have any questions, comments, please feel free to email us. You have the email addresses here, and we will put the presentation and recording also on the website, on the GCP website, where you can find it. With that, thank you and goodbye.